The history of Pittsburgh began with centuries of Native American civilization in the modern Pittsburgh region. Eventually French and British explorers encountered the strategic confluence where the Allegheny and Monongahela Rivers meet to form the Ohio, which leads to the Mississippi River. The area became a battleground when France and Britain fought for control in the 1750s. When the British were victorious, the French ceded control of territories east of the Mississippi. Following American independence in 1783, the village around Fort Pitt continued to grow. The region saw the short-lived Whiskey Rebellion, when farmers rebelled against federal taxes on whiskey. The War of 1812 cut off the supply of British goods, stimulating American manufacture. By 1815, Pittsburgh was producing large quantities of iron, brass, tin, and glass products. By the 1840s, Pittsburgh had grown to one of the largest cities west of the Allegheny Mountains. Production of steel began in 1875. During the 1877 railway riots, it was the site of the most violence and damage in any city affected by the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Workers protested cuts in wages, burning down buildings at the rail yards, including 100 train engines and more than 1,000 cars. 40 men were killed, most of them strikers. By 1911, Pittsburgh was producing half the nation's steel. Pittsburgh was a Republican Party stronghold until 1932. The soaring unemployment of the Great Depression, the New Deal relief programs and the rise of powerful labor unions in the 1930s turned the city into a liberal stronghold of the New Deal coalition, under powerful Democratic mayors. In World War II, it was the center of the arsenal of democracy, producing munitions for the Allied war effort as prosperity returned. Following World War II, Pittsburgh launched a clean air and civic revitalization project known as the Renaissance. The industrial base continued to expand through the 1960s, but after 1970 foreign competition led to the collapse of the steel industry, with massive layoffs and mill closures. Top corporate headquarters moved out in the 1980s. In 2007, the city lost its status as a major transportation hub. The population of the Pittsburgh metropolitan area is holding steady at 2.4 million. It is 65% white and 35% minority. Native American era. For thousands of years, Native Americans inhabited the region where the Allegheny and the Monongahela join to form the Ohio. Paleo-Indians conducted a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in the region perhaps as early as 19,000 years ago. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, an archaeological site west of Pittsburgh, provides evidence that these first Americans lived in the region from that date. During the Adena culture that followed, mound builders erected a large Indian mound at the future site of McKee's Rocks, about 3 miles from the head of the Ohio. The Indian mound, a burial site, was augmented in later years by members of the Hopewell culture. By 1700, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Five Nations based south of the Great Lakes in present-day New York, held dominion over the upper Ohio Valley, reserving it for hunting grounds. Other tribes included the Lenape, who had been displaced from eastern Pennsylvania by European settlement, and the Shawnee, who had migrated up from the south. With the arrival of European explorers, these tribes and others had been devastated by European infectious diseases, such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and malaria, to which they had no immunity. In 1748, when Conrad Weiser visited Logstown, 18 miles downriver from Pittsburgh, he counted 789 warriors gathered. The Iroquois included 163 Seneca, 74 Mohawk, 35 5 Onondaga, 20 Cayuga, and 15 Oneida. Other tribes were 165 Lenape, 162 Shawnee, 100 Wyandot, 40 Tisage-Shromey, and 15 Mohican. Chanopanstown, a Seneca tribe village on the east bank of the Allegheny, was the home village of Queen Aliquippa. It was deserted after 1749. Sawkunk, on the mouth of the Beaver River, was a Lenape settlement and the principal residence of Shingas, a chief of theirs. Chartier's town was a Shawnee town established in 1734 by Peter Chartier. Kittanning was a Lenape and Shawnee village on the Allegheny, with an estimated 300 to 400 residents. Early colonization. The first Europeans arrived in the 1710s as traders. Michael Bezalian was the first to describe the forks of the Ohio in a manuscript in 1717, and later that year European traders established posts and settlements in the area. Europeans first began to settle in the region in 1748, when the First Ohio Company, an English land speculation company, won a grant of 200,000 acres in the upper Ohio Valley, from a post at present-day Cumberland, Maryland. The company began to construct an 80-mile wagon road to the Monongahela River, employing a Delaware Indian chief named Nemacolin and a party of settlers headed by Captain Michael Cresap to begin widening the track into a road. It mostly followed the same route as an ancient Amerindian trail, which is now known as Nemacolin's Trail. The river crossing and flats at Redstone Creek was the earliest point and shortest distance for the descent of a wagon road. Later in the war, the site fortified as Fort Byrd was one of several possible destinations. Another alternative was the divergent route that became Braddock's Road a few years later through present-day New Stanton. In the event, the colonists did not succeed in improving the Amerindian path to a wagon road much beyond the Cumberland Narrows Pass before they were confronted by hostile Native Americans. The colonists later mounted a series of expeditions in order to accomplish piecemeal improvements to the track. The French had built nearby Logstown as a trade and council center for the Native Americans to increase their influence in the Ohio Valley. Between June 15 and November 10, 1749, an expedition headed by Céloron de Bienville, a French officer, traveled down the Allegheny and Ohio to bolster the French claim to the region. De Bienville warned away English traders and posted markers claiming the territory. In 1753, Marquis Duquesne, the governor of New France, sent another, larger expedition. At present-day Erie, Pennsylvania, an advance party built Fort Presqu'Isle. They also cut a road through the woods and built Fort Le Boeuf on French Creek, from which it was possible at high water to float to the Allegheny. By summer, an expedition of 1,500 French and Native American men descended the Allegheny. Some wintered at the confluence of French Creek and the Allegheny. The following year, they built Fort Maquot at that site. Alarmed at these French incursions in the Ohio Valley, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sent Major George Washington to warn the French to withdraw. Accompanied by Christopher Gist, Washington arrived at the forks of the Ohio on November 25, 1753. Proceeding up the Allegheny, Washington presented Dinwiddie's letter to the French commanders first at Venangarde and then Fort Le Boeuf. The French officers received Washington with wine and courtesy, but did not withdraw. Governor Dinwiddie sent Captain William Trent to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio. On February 17, 1754, Trent began construction of the fort as the first European habitation at the site of present-day Pittsburgh. The fort is named Fort Prince George, was only half built by April 1754, when over 500 French forces arrived and ordered the 40-some colonials back to Virginia. The French tore down the British fortification and built Fort Duquesne. Governor Dinwiddie launched another expedition. Colonel Joshua Fry commanded the regiment with his second-in-command, George Washington, leading an advance column. On May 28, 1754, Washington's unit clashed with the French in the Battle of Jumonville-Glen, during which 13 French soldiers were killed and 21 were taken prisoner. After the battle, Washington's ally, Seneca Chief Tannerisson, unexpectedly executed the French commanding officer, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The French pursued Washington, and on July 3, 1754, George Washington surrendered following the Battle of Fort Necessity. These frontier actions contributed to the start of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, an imperial confrontation between England and France fought in both hemispheres. In 1755, George Washington accompanied British General Braddock's expedition. 2 regiments marched from Fort Cumberland across the Allegheny Mountains and into western Pennsylvania, following a path Washington surveyed. Over 3,000 men built a wagon road 12 feet wide that, when complete, was the first road to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Braddock's Road, as it was known, blazed the way for the future National Road. The expedition crossed the Monongahela River on July 9, 1755. French troops from Fort Duquesne ambushed Braddock's expedition at Braddock's Field, 9 miles from Fort Duquesne. In the Battle of the Monongahela, the French inflicted heavy losses on the British, and Braddock was mortally wounded. The surviving British and colonial forces retreated. This left the French and the Native American allies with dominion over the upper Ohio Valley. On September 8, 1756, an expedition of 300 militiamen destroyed the Shawnee and Lenape village of Kittanning, and in the summer of 1758, British General John Forbes began a campaign to capture Fort Duquesne. At the head of 7,000 regular and colonial troops, Forbes built Fort Ligonier and Fort Bedford, from where he cut a wagon road over the Allegheny Mountains, later known as Forbes Road. On the night of September 13–14, 1758, an advance column under Major James Grant was massacred in the Battle of Fort Duquesne. The battleground, the high hill east of the point, was named Grant's Hill in his memory. With this defeat, Forbes decided to wait until spring, but when he heard that the French had lost Fort Frontenac and largely evacuated Fort Duquesne, he planned an immediate attack. Hopelessly outnumbered, the French abandoned and razed Fort Duquesne. Forbes occupied the burned fort on November 25, 1758, and ordered the construction of Fort Pitt, named after British Secretary of State William Pitt the Elder. He also named the settlement between the rivers, Pittsburgh. The British garrison at Fort Pitt made substantial improvements to its fortification. The French never attacked Fort Pitt, and the war soon ended with the Treaty of Paris and French defeat. They ceded the territories east of the Mississippi River, gateway to the west. In 1760, the first considerable European settlement around Fort Pitt began to grow. Traders and settlers built 2 groups of houses and cabins, the Lower Town, near the fort's ramparts, and the Upper Town, along the Monongahela as far as present-day Market Street. In April 1761, a census ordered by Colonel Henry Bouquet counted 332 people and 104 houses. In a final Native American attempt to drive out the British west of the Appalachians, Pontiac's rebellion began with an assault on British forts in May 1763. Ohio Valley and Great Lakes tribes overran many forts. One of the most important targets was Fort Pitt. Receiving warning of the coming attack, Captain Simeon Eckart, the Swiss officer in command of the garrison, prepared for a siege. He leveled the houses outside the ramparts and ordered all settlers into the fort. 330 men, 104 women, and 196 children sought refuge inside its ramparts. Captain Eckhart also gathered stores, which included hundreds of barrels of pork and beef. Pontiac's forces attacked the fort on June 22, 1763. The siege of Fort Pitt lasted for 2 months. Pontiac's warriors kept up a continuous, though ineffective, fire on it from July 27 through August 1, 1763. They drew off to confront the relieving party under Colonel Bouquet, which defeated them in the Battle of Bushy Run. This victory sealed British dominion over the forks of the Ohio, if not the entire Ohio Valley. In 1764, Colonel Bouquet added a redoubt, the Fort Pitt blockhouse, which still stands, the sole remaining structure from Fort Pitt and the oldest authenticated building west of the Allegheny Mountains. The Iroquois signed the Fort Stanwix Treaty of 1768, ceding the lands south of the Ohio to the British. European expansion into the upper Ohio Valley increased. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 families settled in western Pennsylvania between 1768 and 1770. Of these settlers, about a third were English, a third were Scotch-Irish, and the rest were Welsh, German and others. These groups tended to settle together in small farming communities, but often the households were not within hailing distance. The life of a settler family was one of relentless hard work, clearing the forest, stumping the fields, building cabins and barns, planting, weeding, and harvesting. In addition, almost everything was manufactured by hand, including furniture, tools, candles, buttons, and needles. Settlers had to deal with harsh winters, and with snakes, black bears, mountain lions, and timber wolves. Because of the fear of raids by Native Americans, the settlers often built their cabins near, or even on top of, springs, to ensure access to water. They also built blockhouses, where neighbors would rally during conflicts. Increasing violence, especially by the Shawnee, Miami, and Wyandot tribes, led to Dunmore's War in 1774. Conflict with Native Americans continued throughout the American Revolution, as some hoped that the war would end with expulsion of the settlers from the territory. In 1777, Fort Pitt became a United States fort when Brigadier General Edward Hand took command. In 1779, Colonel Daniel Brodhead led 600 men from Fort Pitt to destroy Seneca villages along the upper Allegheny. With the war still ongoing, in 1780 Virginia and Pennsylvania came to an agreement on the mutual borders, creating the state lines known today and determining finally that the jurisdiction of Pittsburgh region was Pennsylvanian. In 1783, the Revolutionary War ended, which also brought at least a temporary cessation of border warfare. In the 1784 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Iroquois ceded the land north of the purchase line to Pennsylvania. After the Revolution, the village of Pittsburgh continued to grow. One of its earliest industries was boat building. Flatboats could use to carry large numbers of pioneers and goods downriver, while keelboats were capable of traveling upriver. The village began to develop vital institutions. Hugh Henry Brackenridge, a Pittsburgh resident and state legislator, introduced a bill that resulted in a gift deed of land and a charter for the Pittsburgh Academy on February 28, 1787. The Academy later developed as the University of Western Pennsylvania and since 1908 has been known as the University of Pittsburgh. Many farmers distilled the corn harvest into whiskey, increasing its value while lowering its transportation costs. At the time, whiskey was used as a form of currency on the frontier. When the federal government imposed an excise tax on whiskey, Western Pennsylvania farmers felt victimized, leading to the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. farmers from the region rallied at Braddock's field and marched on Pittsburgh. The short-lived rebellion was put down, however, when President George Washington sent in militias from several states. The town continued to grow in manufacturing capability. In 1792, the boatyards in Pittsburgh built a sloop, Western Experiment. During the next decades, the yards produced other large boats. By the 19th century, they were building ocean-going vessels that shipped goods as far as Europe. In 1794, the town's first courthouse was built. It was a wooden structure on Market Square. In 1797, the manufacture of glass began. Iron City commerce continued to be an essential part of the economy of early Pittsburgh, but increasingly, manufacture began to grow in importance. Pittsburgh was located in the middle of one of the most productive coal fields in the country. The region was also rich in petroleum, natural gas, lumber, and farm goods. Blacksmiths forged iron implements, from horseshoes to nails. By 1800, the town, with a population of 1,565 persons, had over 60 shops, including general stores, bakeries, and hat and shoe shops. The 1810s were a critical decade in Pittsburgh's growth. In 1811, the first steamboat was built in Pittsburgh. Increasingly, commerce would also flow upriver. The War of 1812 catalyzed growth of the Iron City. The war with Britain, the manufacturing center of the world, cut off the supply of British goods, stimulating American manufacture. Also, the British blockade of the American coast increased inland trade, so that goods flowed through Pittsburgh from all four directions. By 1815, Pittsburgh was producing $764,000 in iron, $249,000 in brass and tin, and $235,000 in glass products. When on March 18, 1816, Pittsburgh was incorporated as a city, it had already taken on some of its defining characteristics: commerce, manufacture, and a constant cloud of coal dust. Other emerging towns challenged Pittsburgh. In 1818, the first segment of the National Road was completed, from Baltimore to Wheeling, bypassing Pittsburgh. This threatened to render the town less essential in east-west commerce. In the coming decade, however, many improvements were made to the transportation infrastructure. In 1818, the region's first river bridge, the Smithfield Street Bridge, opened, the first step in developing the City of Bridges over its two rivers. On October 1, 1840, the original Pennsylvania Turnpike was completed, connecting Pittsburgh and the eastern port city of Philadelphia. In 1834, the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal was completed, making Pittsburgh part of a transportation system that included rivers, roads, and canals. Manufacture continued to grow. In 1835, McClurg, Wade & Co. built the first locomotive west of the Alleghenies. Already, Pittsburgh was capable of manufacturing the most essential machines of its age. By the 1840s, Pittsburgh was one of the largest cities west of the mountains. In 1841, the second courthouse on Grant's Hill was completed. Made from polished gray sandstone, the courthouse had a rotunda 60 feet in diameter and 80 feet high. Like many burgeoning cities of its day, Pittsburgh's growth outstripped some of its necessary infrastructure, such as a water supply with dependable pressure. Because of this, on April 10, 1845, a great fire burned out of control, destroying over 1,000 buildings and causing $9 million in damages. As the city rebuilt, the age of rails arrived. In 1851, the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad began service between Cleveland and Allegheny City. In 1854, the Pennsylvania Railroad began service between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Despite many challenges, Pittsburgh had grown into an industrial powerhouse. An 1857 article provided a snapshot of the Iron City. 939 factories in Pittsburgh and Allegheny City employing more than 10,000 workers, producing almost $12 million in goods using 400 steam engines. Total coal consumed, 22 m bushels. Total iron consumed, 127 ktons. In steam tonnage, third busiest port in the nation, surpassed only by New York City and New Orleans.